Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to attending this lecture session. My name is Yiyun Shou, and I'm a lead scientist at the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk. And this is also known as its short name by IPUR. So in IPUR, we do research and activities focusing on the public and the experts' perception of risk. So for this lecture session, I think all of you have had either first or second-hand experience of misinformation or rumor. We have people around us, they gossip, they love sharing all the articles, information via Facebook or the social networks. We also say all kinds of news information from all sorts of sources. And some of the information that can be not verified, but sometimes we just see them everywhere. So how these things could influence us in terms of our attitudes and behaviors towards important things such as COVID pandemic and everyday lifestyle decisions. Today, you will be hearing a presentation from Professor Heidi Larson and on this very timely subject. So Professor Heidi Larson is a professor of anthropology, risk and decision science at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Her research focuses on the analysis of social and political factors that can affect uptake of health interventions and influence policies. She is also the founding director of the Vaccine Confidence Project. And through this global program, she is pioneering the work around understanding the discourse around vaccine hesitancy and the ways we may rebuild trust. Her most recent work involves a global study on public discourse around current and potential measures to contain and treat COVID-19. So you will be hearing more about her work now. Please join me in welcoming Professor Larson.
Usually the questions come at the end, but I'm glad you, hope you caught that QR code. Thanks to all of you for coming. It is, I think we're all getting used to in-person events slowly. I'm happy to be here and not looking into a Zoom as I have been most of the past couple of years. I'm going to talk about, as you just heard, rumors, myth, and misinformation and why they stick. It's one of the key areas that we look at in our risk study and our risk research at the Institute and related work. I'll start with a definition, and I really like to start when I talk about rumors by saying they have a bad reputation. Somebody says it's just a rumor. There's a suggestion that it couldn't be true, when in fact a rumor is just an unverified piece of information that can actually be true, or the beginning of some truth, or not. So we need to keep that in perspective, because certainly in epidemiology and infectious diseases, we're constantly paying attention to rumors as signals of disease outbreaks. WHO, the World Health Organization, has a whole archive of smallpox rumors at the end of the smallpox eradication campaign, where they listen for every possible signal, any rumor of somebody exhibiting the smallpox infection, because if it's not eradicated until it's eradicated everywhere. So we should be careful before we just delete rumors without knowing what the real truth is. So this is from in Brazil. We did a lot of work with mothers of children who had microcephaly. There were a lot of rumors there that it was because of the MMR vaccine, not because of Zika. Fake news, which some people think was a term invented by Trump. He actually thinks he invented a lot of things, but fake news has been here for a long time. And it was even used, and this is a graphic image from the Wellcome Trust archives from 1894. So fake news has been used as a tool to mislead, to misguide. And sometimes I think one of the big things we have to remember when we think about rumors and study them, what's the motive? Sometimes it's an accidental rumor. Something looks plausible on your smartphone or whatever, and you share it. Not intentionally trying to spread fake news, but it had some level of plausibility. But there are, as I'm sure anyone who reads the newspaper knows, a lot of intentionally motivated negative and fake information to misguide people, especially in times of like pandemics and wars. This was in the 1940s. The growth of research on rumors and risk science particularly had a lot of research and a lot of publications around in the 1940s around the Second World War. It was something that the evil axis is also not something that was discovered, coined more recently. That goes back also to the Second World War. But this is the kind of mapping that was already being done on a chalkboard instead of on a digital tablet. But the whole process of how you manage and who are the people we need to pay attention to, who are the influencers, who are the spreaders, intentionally or not. There was even at Harvard, the psychiatry department set up a rumor clinic in conjunction with the Boston Herald. And what they did was there were a lot of rumors circulating, people in the US wondering, who had brothers, sons, husbands at war in Europe with very little access to information, not even a postal address, although some tried to send letters. And to help manage the anxiety and the rumors, they set up this clinic, and if you heard a rumor, you sent it by mail to the Boston Herald. And once a week, they would look at what was the most common rumor and debunk it. But if you can imagine, if we took one rumor at a time, once a week, we would be far behind. We're already pretty far behind publicly motivated rumors these days. But today, the dynamics are different. This one I found particularly fascinating. A lot of the imagery around, particularly the Astrazeneca vaccine, which has more links to monkeys from some of the serum. There were images that if you took this vaccine, you would become a monkey. But in 200 years ago, with the very first vaccine, the word vaccine comes from vacca, which is Latin for cow, because the very first vaccine against smallpox came from scrapings of cowpox. And it was those scrapings that they used and scraped onto children's or adults' arms, and that gave them some protection because they noticed that it was the milkmaids who were getting the milk from the cow, that when there was circulating virus, for some reason, the milkmaids weren't getting infected. So they realized that there was some protective factor with the cow. But that, of course, spurned all these rumors about people becoming cows. And now it's monkeys. As I said, the dynamics are different now. It's not spreading at the pace it was certainly not in the 1800s, nor around the Second World War. The whole field of digital technology has really created a superhighway for the spread of rumors. Already in 2018, Nature asked me to do a commentary on what I thought was the biggest pandemic risk. And I said, frankly, I think we have to really pay attention to viral misinformation. That was before WHO coined the term infodemic, and we started to see what the real impact would be. One of the more, I don't know if popular is the word, but one of the more concerning rumors was the fact that COVID didn't even exist. It's a scam. It's motivated. We heard that in the beginning of Ebola in West Africa. There was graffiti on the walls in Sierra Leone and in Guinea. Ebola is not real because it's not familiar. It's not something that people, it didn't make sense. And a lot of the symptoms for Ebola, as well as COVID, could be explained by other diseases. So again, a big thing about rumor traction is the plausibility of the rumor. But what was challenging in the pandemic is that it wasn't just people who were conspiracy prone, it was leaders of countries. This is Bolsonaro. It was general public. It was very widespread. And when someone doesn't even believe a virus exists, they're not even going to consider something like a vaccine, or why would I need a mask because this isn't even real? Why are you locking us up at home? So some of the principles that I really looked at and have framed in my book called Stuck, How Rumors Start and Why They Don't Go Away. We talk about triggers, what sparks a rumor, fertile ground, what is fertile ground for it to spread, and what are the amplifiers. And amplifiers can be different things. And one of the things in a lot of the global research I've done is the same rumor in 3, 4, 5 different countries can have very different outcomes. In some countries, it can fizzle and die. In other settings, it can cause outrage. And in a third, it can stumble along and maybe get translated into something else. So uncertainty are particularly fertile grounds for rumors, like COVID, any pandemics, any outbreaks, natural disasters, when people are scared, uncertain. Hurricane Katrina in the US was also a time where people didn't know which way to go, what's really causing this, and other, the tsunami in 2006, I believe it was. All these environments are particularly fertile ground for rumors because people are seeking explanations for what's going on. Distrust is a big one. We've certainly seen that in the COVID pandemic. There's a very strong correlation between distrust in government and unwillingness to take a vaccine. And on the contrary, the more people trusted the way the government was handling the response, it was the biggest predictor of their willingness to take a vaccine. And we also talk about it, a little information is a dangerous thing. It was some author, there's some different views on who was the very first author to coin that term. But when you have a little information but not the complete information, that people want to figure out what it really is about. And social networks, either in person or socially and digitally amplified, are also a characteristic. This distrust and uncertainty is not brand new. We've had it. It's been a growing phenomena. All the global trust barometers have seen over the last decade a kind of slow decline that really took a deep dive during COVID. Because of the nature of the digital landscape, our research group, the Vaccine Confidence Project, has really moved from, when I founded it in 2010, we were really looking at online news media, because social media was not ubiquitous like it is today. But over the last particularly 5 years, we've done more and more analysis of social media, looking not at individual rumors, but looking at swarms, looking at group dynamics, looking at spreads. Now this is a map of Facebook groups. The blobs, the dots here, are a Facebook group. The blue are the positive ones, and the red are the negative ones. The green are undecided. Groups that are talking about vaccines are not overtly positive or negative, just mum's nets trying to discuss what to do, or other groups. And even though the blue groups have almost 7 million users, and the red groups only just over 4 million, what's interesting is the red, the anti-groups, are much more nuanced and splintering. It's like the difference between, I don't know if you would follow this, but the IBM, one big company in a sense, versus Silicon Valley with a lot of startups and a lot of smaller companies trying to be responsive to multiple needs. And the tactics of the anti-groups are far more effective. They are recruiting people in the green group at 1,000% expansion a year. and the positive is only 200. So that's like 500% faster recruiting people who are undecided, which is a huge challenge, certainly for the public health community. Well, we talk about how that this trend is going in terms of perceptions and how people are talking about it, but and the impact of misinformation. But I get a lot of questions from media, from policymakers saying, but does it really affect people at the end of the day, whether they take the vaccine or not? So we did a control trial between, we had 8,000 people, 4,000 in the US, 4,000 in the UK. We did, with all of them, we did interviews before, asking a number of questions about COVID, but within that said, would you take a COVID vaccine once we have one? And 41% in the US said they would, definitely, and 54% in the UK said they would definitely take one. Then we showed them 4,000, of the 4,000, 1,000 got normal, straightforward information, and 3,000 got misinformation. We picked the 5 most frequently circulating pieces of misinformation. These are examples of some of the misinformation. And then we came back to them all, interviewed them again about different aspects of COVID, and again put in the question, would you take a COVID vaccine? There was an over 6% drop in people's willingness to take a COVID vaccine among the groups that were exposed to COVID, to the misinformation. For the 1,000 that saw accurate information, no impact. It didn't improve their willingness, and it just didn't change anything. But what was interesting to me, because we also looked at the impact of each of the individual pieces of misinformation, and by the way, at the end, we made absolutely sure that we made it clear that this was misinformation, this was not accurate, so that they didn't leave this trial thinking that what they saw was real. I mean, it was fact. The one that was the most effective and impacting people was the one that looks like a genetics textbook. What it says is absolutely, the conclusion it comes to is absolutely wrong and misguiding, but because it looked like science, a lot of people thought this must be right, this has to be right. We also have done a lot of research across Africa in collaboration with Africa CDC, and there too, we saw quite a dominant amount of misinformation. COVID is planned by some foreign actor, it's not real. People in Africa are being used as guinea pigs. Vaccine trials have killed people, which is absolutely not true. And the spread of COVID is linked to 5G towers. I don't know if you heard that here, but in the UK and Netherlands was even worse. There were multiple 5G towers burned down. People working at these towers were aggressively attacked in parts of the UK and I know in a number of other countries. What's interesting to me is the rumor about 5G causing COVID has historic links, because around SARS it was 4G. And before that, I think it was 3G and avian flu. But anyway, there's something about technology, particularly newer technology, that also has an uncertainty, and people are trying to connect, well, what's different? What's changed in my environment that could have a connection here? Again, we did research in 15 countries, and they just didn't. Some of the reasons we heard in Africa were absolutely the same thing we were hearing in Europe, in the US, and in some of our Asia research. I don't trust it. I don't believe the virus exists. I'm concerned about safety. I don't feel I'm at risk. That's somebody else's problem. And I just don't have enough information, which was fair enough. So why do I care? I mean, this is not just an academic exercise. Why I really care about this is because when I was leading UNICEF's strategy and communication for the global immunization program between 2000 and 2005, we saw an absolute increase in the number of individuals, communities, even some government officials who are saying, we don't want that new vaccine. And UNICEF was not used to people not wanting the good things that UNICEF had to offer. So I got the nickname of the director of UNICEF's fire department because I was going around putting out rumor fires all kinds of places around the world. I mean, totally from Ouagadougou to Hanoi to, Berlin to Rio. And one of the ones that actually prompted me to leave UNICEF and set up this research group was polio. In 2003, 2004, there were rumors circulating in Nigeria, particularly among the north, which is dominantly Muslim, and the south is dominantly Christian, wealthier, and there was tensions between the two. And the Christian, wealthier south won the presidential election over the north. The north didn't like that. They were also it was also the time of the Iraq War, and there was a lot of suspicion about the West, and the axis of evil was targeting Muslims. That was the perception. So rumors started circulating in the north that these polio vaccines were out to sterilize Muslims, full stop. And the governor stopped all the vaccination, 11 months. And I was part of the team trying to manage these rumors, change the sentiment. We had, Islamic leaders coming from Egypt, from other places. The head of WHO sat with the head of the Organization of Islamic States. A lot of negotiations to try to change the minds of these people. In the meanwhile, over 11 months, the rumors about these, because of the drop in vaccination acceptance, polio spread to all these countries. Polio coming back to countries that had been certified polio-free, going as far as Indonesia. And this map is actually not totally accurate because the line there that goes to Indonesia actually was because the pilgrimage to Mecca is what was the vector. Because the Muslims from Indonesia were going to Mecca, and Muslims from northern Nigeria also were going to Mecca. And that was the happy spreading place. And there's a lot of very interesting research on mass migration, and with that, mass spread of diseases and rumors. And that was the moment I said, no one took this rumor seriously. They let it get totally out of control. We need to set up an early detection warning system when these things start coming up. And that was the whole point of this research group I set up. And we've been following this around different vaccines. This was the spread of rumors around an HPV vaccine that shut down multiple programs, including in Japan, for 9 years. And what does all this mean outside of vaccines, which happen to have been my focus? I'm expanding to look at this and how it's affecting other health interventions. But this was from this year's World Economic Forum risk report. And it looked around the world, 124 countries. How do you feel about the world? And it wasn't a very positive outlook. And it's a very polarized outlook also. Of the top 10 risks that people perceived, aside from climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, social cohesion erosion, in other words, polarization, was one of the top 4, above infectious diseases, even in the context of a pandemic. And the erosion of social cohesion had the biggest decline of all the risks, almost 30% decline in social cohesion. And that is largely because of polarization. And going back to my earlier slides of looking at that map of the positive and the negative, that's a dynamic that is happening across multiple issues. So I think when we think about myth and rumor, they may be a signal, but I think there's far too much attention to just debunking pieces of misinformation and not looking at what's driving it behind it. It's about deeper emotions. It's about beliefs, alternative beliefs. It's about polarization of publics. And until we understand and address that, we're not going to stop what's going on with the spread of rumors. I'm not saying we don't need facts, and that if we see that there's a damaging rumor, like drink chlorine to cure COVID, of course you want to make sure that people know not to do that. But that alone is not going to fix this. So I think at many levels we need to wipe the slate clean and start over in looking at our communication strategy, health delivery strategies, even around how we build public engagement to address climate change. We have very different publics than 10 years ago, dramatically different. They're much more questioning, they're much more distrusting, much more polarized, much more empowered because of democracy in some settings, because of social media that is transcending borders. And what they're also doing is getting incredibly sophisticated in going around social media regulation. They know what the rules are. So they will change the nature of what they're putting out there to be a question instead of a statement. And when it's a question, it's much harder for a social media platform, say Facebook, to delete it, because that starts to betray freedom of press, freedom of speech. So they start to turn things into questions. You can't legally say, take this billboard down in New Zealand, but it does provoke people who might have normally just thought vaccines were fine, but now they started to think twice. I don't really know what is in a vaccine. It's also about emotions, and particularly in the context of COVID, there was a lot of anger. We were in a global, and it's not over totally, global pressure cooker. One of the more interesting studies on the vaccine acceptance and willingness was by some colleagues in France. There were 1 million surveys around the world about would you take a COVID vaccine or will you take a COVID vaccine. But they took a different spin, which I thought and think is really important. They talked to a large cohort of people in France just after they got their vaccine. And they asked them, after you were vaccinated, did you feel relief? I felt relief. Did you feel regret? Oh, I really wish I wouldn't have done that. I really regret it. I should have thought again. Or resent. I'm really angry I did that. I did it because I wanted to go to the pub. I wanted to go to that rock concert. I wanted to go to a football match, whatever. But you will not see me at that vaccine clinic again. And we are seeing that actually in our global research on vaccine confidence. Overall vaccine confidence, aside from COVID, has dropped globally. Not just uptake, confidence. And that's a very worrying trend. So, as I said, a lot of this is, and one of the big challenging things for public health is that a lot of the drivers of these issues are outside of a health program. And it's difficult. Your health promotion activities will never address these issues. The only way that we've seen that can start to change these is working with partners outside of health, because many times the solution is not sitting in the health department. And sometimes health promotion aggravates the problem because the people say, information is not my issue, and you're not listening to what's bothering me. And we've seen not just hesitation, but we've seen overt aggression. And one of the things that keeps me up at night when they ask is the level of aggression, and that's actually been quite serious in some setting. And these protests are all over the world. I mean, really extreme images and protests. This was in Brussels. France has had more overt aggression, but Belgium and Brussels in particular typically hadn't had kind of such anger about vaccines, but it started to become such an issue related to freedoms and choice. And it was partly largely the COVID situation that exacerbated it. But these were things going on already before. And one of the surprising things to the UK government was when the NHS health workers, the health professionals, took their scrubs and laid them across Trafalgar Square, protesting against the mandate that healthcare workers get a vaccine. That's pretty extreme. When health workers, who are the ones that we count on to be the front line, start protesting, there's a problem. There's a breakdown in the relationship with government. This is one of our big studies on COVID vaccine acceptance. We ask a lot of other questions when we ask about willingness to take a COVID vaccine, for instance. But when we looked at our data on willingness to take a COVID vaccine against age, education, employment, health status, stress, and in that list of other questions we asked, how did you feel about how the government handled the pandemic? That was the strongest predictor, as I mentioned earlier, of people's willingness to take a COVID vaccine. Much bigger than age, much bigger than education, income, all the other factors. We have seen, by the way, since then, because we continue to look at not just COVID vaccine confidence, but broader, that the period of COVID has created a divide between what adults and older adults and younger populations feel about vaccines. The younger populations are angry that they were told to take these vaccines when they felt like it was not their problem and their lives were being compromised because of it. It was a very strong sentiments. But as I mentioned, a lot of this is not about facts, it's about beliefs, it's about freedoms, and to the extent that this was one poster that, that's freedom. I mean, and what I heard one series of interviews with again, healthcare professionals, not the ones protesting, but ones who said, I always try to talk to people, I always try to listen, and I could have that conversation around H1N1, but something happened in COVID. It made people just shut the conversation down. And there are a few essays by some doctors who felt like they were just really up against a wall, and there was an absolute lack of respect for scientific fact, and they really frustration. And what happened was also not just a rejection of the science by some, but there was a lot of aggression towards scientists. We had to have some scientists in different parts of the world with bodyguards, with police protecting their houses. We had one scientist who advised government in Belgium who had to be taken underground and hidden in a house in the Netherlands until they found the guy running around with a rifle. In other countries, there have been different issues. The two people who are key with the mRNA platform needed 8 bodyguards in one event to go from, and science was the Great Enlightenment. I mean, the Enlightenment was a time when science was free thinking, freedom from religious dogma. And what we're seeing in all of our research globally is that people are seeing science as the new dogma. And they're going back to beliefs, back to natural methods, back to other ways, because they feel like science says, therefore you do, without consideration of people's values, their lives, and the other situations in their lives. So we're going to need a change in how we engage people. There's a lot of pointing to the anti-science movement. I don't like to frame it as anti-science. I think what the issue is people feel like science is is out there alone and has been the key influencer of policies without consideration of the implications of what some of those policies, whether it was saying work at home for people who couldn't work at home, or school your kids at home when a poor family with 4 kids maybe has 1 laptop or none, or someone living alone, that enough of the human factors were not taken into consideration. Rishi Sunak, who was one of the 2 candidates for Prime Minister, said it was wrong to empower scientists. And he's a smart guy. I mean, he's an economist. This is not crazy talk, but what he did say is we needed to put, the title is extreme, but one of his points was we should have had the scientists, the Minister of Health, and heads of business sitting together saying, this is what the science says, this is the practical reality for education and the implications, this is the implication for business. We need to think together about how we go forward. And this is not just any particular region in the world. We've seen these issues come up all over the world. So, since I should wrap up now, and should have probably 5 minutes ago already, this is my book, and I just wanted to show you the contents because it's kind of a summary of the points I was talking about. The importance of dignity and the power of distrust in undermining dignity, on the volatility of opinion, that it changes. You can't just do a survey about how people feel about a vaccine in February 2020 and think it's going to be the same in December of 2020. People's emotions around health interventions in general are very volatile, much more so than they used to be. Emotional contagion, the spread of sentiment. We saw around the HPV suspension of the government's recommendation of HPV, that went viral. That affected a group of girls in Denmark who started fainting and started to having all kinds of reactions. It jumped to Ireland, where a big group started to resent the vaccine, and they started a group called Regret, and went down to Colombia. This all spread via social media, YouTube, this little video of these Japanese girls fainting, shaking, and the parents, angry parents. In Colombia, I saw the same little video, subtitled in English, voiceover in Spanish, 600 girls across a district of Colombia, fainting, shaking, claiming this vaccine was going to kill them. So this emotional spread via these new digital mediums are very, we really need to be alert to them. Then the power of belief. In this book, I closed the manuscript and it went on to the press with the last chapter, Pandemics and Publics, about 2 months before COVID was declared. They did let me, at the 11th hour, put in a short preface that we were there. And it just came out with a second edition that I reflect on 2 years of COVID. This is our website, the Confidence Project, and it's the Vaccine Confidence Project, but we're increasingly calling it the Confidence Project because it's beyond vaccines, and just started a new, the link is wrong here. Started a new initiative called the Global Listening Project. It's listeningproject.global, but we're doing focus groups around the world listening to what people are feeling and thinking and what their experiences were in COVID, so we can pay better attention to publics for the next one, which we will have. Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi, very much for such interesting and inspiring lecture. And it's very interesting to see how vaccine, usually we think it's only relevant to health. It has already extended beyond health there are so many social and political dimensions around this discourse. And I also believe the audience have a lot of questions. Just a reminder that you can use the Mentimeter and scan the QR code to input your questions. So before we start the Q&A session, please let me introduce our panel member, Lisa Robinson. To join the conversation, so Lisa is the head of advisory and policy at BBC Media Action. She advises on media and communication strategies, and she specialized in areas including climate change, disaster risk, and emergency responses. And Lisa and her team have been addressing topics in health, media development, governance, and information disorder. So now we are going to continue this conversation around the vaccine and around the misinformation, and to see perspective not only from academic perspective but also from media perspective. We will also answer your questions submit on this website along this conversation. So actually the first question we received from audience is about the science question. So Heidi, about your global survey and the clinical or trial, controlled trial study, try to investigate people's perception attitude towards vaccine. So how did the responses get collected? Participants in your studies, they are representative sample, or there are certain section of the population?
It's a good question. For the Vaccine Confidence Index, we do nationally representative samples that are run, like in Nigeria. This part of the survey in the north is house to house in local language. In the Abuja and Lagos area, they do it more by internet and phone. So basically, globally, there are research groups on the ground that work in local language, and like our focus groups we're running around the world now are, again, local language research groups that we've developed a really good network with over the years. Yep.
That's impressive. That is very extensive.
So it's been a lot of work.
So we can be definitely confident most of the population can be relatively representative of the view from the public, not just a selection of people who are interested in this topic.
I mean, to be fair, these are nationally representative. So what we're particularly looking at is trends over time, and to really get a nuanced understanding of what's driving any change, you need to do more deep dive local listening. But what this does let you do is we can see where there are drops in confidence or where there's an increase in confidence. For instance, across Africa, we saw serious drops in confidence across many countries, except Cote d'Ivoire. It was the one country where confidence went up during COVID. We also saw that they had a very positive sense of how the government handled the response. So that's the kind of place we want to go local and do a case study of what they did right, basically. And in the same vein, we've seen Nigeria and DR Congo have a significant drop. So there we want to go and do more local research. The reality is you just can't do locally deep research all the time in all countries. So we have a kind of triage approach of monitoring at this nationally representative level, but we watch for any changes, and then and we're also kind of have an on-call, because sometimes countries contact us and say, we know we have a problem, we don't know how big it is or how to manage it. So we go in there and then we'll do local.
Thank you. So it's very interesting to see some of the misinformation, they have a science hat on them, and they use some pictures from the science journals, and they have like totally different conclusion. So like as a scientist, we always stay in our own office or labs. Sometimes we are not aware of the things happening outside. So, what is the role scientists should play in the space in terms of reducing the impact of misinformation?
It's also a good question. One of the things that really worries me, and I'm sorry if there, didn't know if there was somebody hiding behind the podium. I mean, not intentionally hiding, but is the last few slides where I was talking about aggression towards scientists. It's become such an issue that both science and nature journals have done their own surveys with scientists and researchers. And they too have seen, I think 38% of scientists that Nature interviewed reported some pretty severe aggression, either physical or verbal or threats. And what they also asked was the impact of this aggression. And there was, in both the science and nature surveys, they found that scientists, and we've seen this in our own work, are feeling much less like talking. They just don't want to go out there because it's so toxic. They don't want to go on social media where we need scientists because it's just too. Tony Fauci, who's just been Mr. Good Guy for 80 years of his tenure, all of a sudden is the big bad guy, and they have to surround his house with police. These are you get inhibited to be talking when we need scientists more than ever. So I think we need to rethink how scientists can engage in a safe way for themselves and for others. And I think we also need to think about forums where we can bring together scientists and media, scientists and policymakers, scientists and other forums. We've seen that while trust in government has dropped dramatically over the last decade, but plummeted during COVID, business has come up and is right now the number one of all the institutions, the number one that publics, this is in 124 countries, said they would trust the most to get us out of this mess. They said business. And that, to me, was interesting. And some of that was reflecting people who felt like it was their employers that were helping them out more, that they had a different kind of community in their employee base. Others just felt like, business, maybe they've got more resources, maybe they're more straightforward. There was a whole mix of reasons. So I think bringing scientists in, there's been a whole shift from the idea of, what do you call them, macro influencers like the big football stars or rock stars, or that's out now. When you're trying to get messages and engagement these days, it's micro influencers, it's smaller groups. It also feels safer, and people feel more in touch with that. So I think ways that we can create other forums, and we can't forget that people still talk to each other. And we want to keep it that way. So I think there's been an important attention to social media, but we can't forget about the other forums that people interact in.
Yes, certainly scientists should be more engaging or more motivated to engage with the public in terms of.
But we also have to be fair to scientists because and understand that it's not an easy thing to do in this environment.
That's true.
Yeah.
So how about Lisa, what's your view on the role of media in this process? Sometimes we also say media want to help, say, report the science information, the science new articles. So what is the role of media in this process?
Heidi was talking about how scientists and media and other actors can come together to talk about some of these things. A lot of times those conversations happen through media, on a media platform. And I think media has a responsibility to help address some of that polarization, to role model some more civil conversations so that the aggression that scientists are feeling in real life isn't replicated or role modeled on media. I think the media can actually role model more productive conversations. That said, the media is under a lot of economic pressure, financial pressure as well. So there are a lot of things that the media can do better and differently. At the same time, if we're looking at a commercial model of media, that sells. Emotion sells, and that's very difficult to break through and be responsible sometimes if you don't have a really solid funding base. So the same applies with social media as well. You're rewarded for more emotional posts over factual posts. So I work with media in low-income and middle-income countries who are under really challenging financial circumstances. So sometimes they don't even have the resources to keep the generator on, go out and interview people, listen to people, let alone do a lot of intensive research to understand the science and the facts behind this. And so I think that recognizing what shifts can happen in financial models, what sustainability models could help address some of this, but still hold media to higher standards that we would expect to help address so many of the issues that Heidi mentioned around polarization and access to information that we trust and that we can understand.
So we see challenge from both scientist side and media side. So definitely more collaborative work is needed to better address this problem. We also see a lot of questions, very interesting questions from the audience. One of the questions is, what are the effective strategies to counter misinformation? So in your research, what are the current effective strategies people are using to address this problem, especially in public health?
Well, one thing you shouldn't do is when you see a piece of online misinformation, do not directly interact with it because you're just fueling it. So if you see something comes into one of your social media that's promoting, I don't know, eat garlic and that'll save you from the next plague, whatever, you don't respond to it saying, no, don't eat garlic, because then you're fueling the whole thing. But what you need to do is when you do see things that are wrong, get a separate forum that starts to talk about garlic is great in my pasta, but I would never take it to, I don't know what, prevent my, the plague or whatever disease. But just be careful of how you respond to certain things. But the other thing is, as I was saying, we need to, when we do hear a piece of misinformation, to think of multiple offline forums also, where you can start to build an alternative story. Because the problem with rumors is you can't just shut them down. You have to fill that space with something else, with something better, with something plausible, not just with a piece of dry fact, because that will not engage anyone. We've seen that. So I think that's, and what are some examples? Actually, one of my favorite examples, and we've seen this in different countries, but in the US, we had a real issue in particularly a Black community who was a bit marginalized and distrusting of the government in Baltimore and Maryland, which is not far from Washington, D.C. And they realized that some local researchers from the University of Maryland saw that one of the places where a lot of these people hung out was the barbers and the hairdressers, not just to get their hair done or cut or braided or whatever, but it was kind of a place where people hung out. they had a cup of coffee there. They would just sit around and chat. Sometimes they'd get their hair cut or whatever. But it was like their gathering place. And the barber was kind of the trusted guy. And it was a place that people went back to. And they developed a relationship with him or her, depending on the salon, over time. Because you go back and get your hair cut, or you go back and so these were long, trusted relationships. So they started to pull some barbers together and start to give them some of the positive, not just positive information, the factual information, what was known, what wasn't known, what was coming, where they could get more information. And so he's got a captive audience in his seat. And while he's cutting the hair or the beard or braiding the hair, start sharing some of that information. And it really shifted, it dramatically shifted the sentiments in this, it was not a small community, towards, because the barber thought it was a good idea, so well, actually, maybe it's okay. And then to the point where they brought one of the vaccination sites in that neighborhood, and they gave vaccinations there. And it was really, and in London, in the Bangladeshi community, which had some of the worst levels of mortality, it was a group of Bangladeshi restaurant owners who started doing selfies of themselves getting vaccinated and sharing it with people and saying, listen, get your vaccine. We've had a lot of people die in our community. Also, we want to open our restaurants because particularly in cities where, big families, small spaces, you gather with the extended family at a restaurant. And you couldn't do that. So here, get your vaccine so we can start getting our families back together. And that had a really powerful impact. So I think some of these unexpected local influencers are becoming again, not attacking a piece of misinformation, but kind of surrounding it with trusted and accurate information. Also, sometimes you don't, like in the case of COVID, you don't have the perfect answer because it's a time of uncertainty. But then you need to be honest about that and say, this is how much information we have now. We're going to have more soon, but this is the latest we have, and we'll keep sharing it with you. So I think that's important too, to not pretend you have all the answers.
It's very interesting to hear the restaurant and the barber, the example, like certainly people more trust the source when they have personal relationship with the source and possibly perceive the information are more credible. So it seems like trust and distrust is a central topic in the misinformation discourse. So how do you think like trust and distrust can fuel the rumor and the misinformation?
How it can?
How can, so say for the trust and distrust in different like parties, on different stakeholders, how these things actually fuel the spread of misinformation and
okay.
Yeah.
How do they fuel the spread? Well, when people don't trust government, when there's distrust, people won't trust the information, the guidance that they're getting from those that they distrust. So they start looking elsewhere. Some people have commented to me, Facebook and Twitter and a few other social media platforms have started to put a flag up when you search for vaccines, for instance, to say, go to WHO or go to CDC or go to your Ministry of Health. Well, a number of people have said, I've been there. They don't have the answers to my questions. So I think that you need, and when you're not getting information there, and you're not sure if you even trust it, that's when people start going elsewhere. So that's, and going to people that they trust. And you can trust people, but they may not be the people with the right information. Not that they intentionally have bad information, they just don't, it's not their role.
Yeah, so what do you think actually cause distrust and polarization? And are there any way we can address this problem in terms of distrust?
Yeah, I think that's a good question also. We often talk about building trust with the public, but we often wag our fingers at the public when in fact there's some situations where I totally understand their distrust. The government has betrayed them, the government hasn't given them what they need. So you can't start to build trust in a place where people have a legitimate reason to be distrusting. So I think that one of the things we need to look at is how can institutions build trustworthiness. And one of the things I've been saying recently is that we need to use COVID recovery as a time to rebuild trust. There are so many things that people missed during COVID. They missed a lot of health appointments, they missed dentists, they missed vaccinations, they missed so many things. And if we can slowly, one, listen to what their needs are, be there for them, I think that can be a really important trust building opportunity. If we don't do that, it's just going to get worse.
Yes. So what's your view, Lisa, on the media side? So how media contribute to the building trust and distrust, either in the science field or any other field?
I think that media can play a role in how those conversations happen. So yes, individuals can and should be speaking to their healthcare providers and talking to others. At the same time, sometimes people don't know who to trust or how to trust. And in the same way that there are many publics, sometimes there are also many scientists, many different kinds of...
With different views.
Exactly. So the media can play a role in holding those conversations at scale on a platform. So they might have a few people, they might be asking the questions that audiences themselves could or should be asking. So if we have the media, again, role modeling, the kinds of questions that people might even be afraid to ask themselves directly in public, to make it easier to ask the questions, help identify some of those questions, and show what it might look like to have a tricky conversation with your doctor or someone else. I think they can role model behavior in so many ways as well. So if you have situations where perhaps somebody in the family is doubting science, finding the skills and the ability to have those awkward conversations, to confront somebody in a really productive way, also can be played out in a safe space of the media. I think the media definitely has a responsibility also to do their own selection process to make sure that the people that they are holding up as trustworthy really are so. And it can take time and resources to get that right, but I think there's a huge responsibility in making that happen.
Lisa, that is actually a question actually addressed to you. So is the media's attitudes and approach to scientists changing? So say several years ago, positive media has a certain understanding attitude towards science and scientists. Has this been changed or it's still the same?
There's no answer. I can't answer for the media overall. And there are many medias. I think that the medias that we're seeing are reflecting. It's a relationship that goes back and forth, reflecting what we're seeing in society as well. So I can't say that how media is relating with science or scientists. I think at the same time we're seeing some mainstream media perhaps demonstrating that aggression that you're talking about. We're also seeing a lot more documentary media. It's a lot more fact-based. Over the years, there's more in-depth airtime to science. But you've got some views maybe from outside of a media perspective.
No, I think you captured it.
Okay, so we also have other questions from the audience. So some audience, I think, notice that in your examples, it seems like rumors and misinformation get spread very fast in in developing countries or underdeveloped countries, where the education level could potential role. So the audience is trying to ask, are there any relationship between the level of education at the population level relevant to the spread of misinformation and the rumors?
We see no relation with education. We see some relatively high educated people having some very curious beliefs in the same way. And this is what's a fascinating phenomena about it right now, is the tendency for conspiracy is not because of a lack of education. I mean, there are issues in some less educated, poor communities that don't have access to information, but some of that is a more legitimate need for information. But when it starts to get conspiratorial, we're seeing that at all levels of education and income, and that to me is newer, the level of it at any rate. You somehow understand it more in a place where, people might not have education or might not have resources to know better. But then when you start to see the same kind of, and what's interesting is we see like a U, like at the highest education and the lowest education are less vaccinated for different reasons. In the lower educated, it's more really a lack of having access or resources or education to know. And then on the high end, it's just, other belief systems. And then in the middle, it's the middle. It's a mix of things. But yeah, it's fascinating. And even, as I was saying, the biggest predictor of vaccine uptake was not education, it wasn't income, it wasn't... we do see that women generally are a bit more skeptical than men on vaccines. There were some countries that men were a bit more skeptical, particularly in Muslim countries where they were more the decision makers about health access. But that may also be that women in general, particularly mothers, are thinking about vaccines more because of children and whatever. But that's only with vaccines. Conspiracy in the context of and misinformation in the context of COVID was well beyond vaccines. It was at multiple levels. Yeah.
I think certainly belief formation is a very special process. It's not a necessary education can influence your belief formation. Even you are highly educated, you can still form some very bizarre beliefs. Yeah.
Like freedom to infect others. That's. Some people felt like, they genuinely believed that this, the herd immunity approach, the natural herd immunity approach, was going to be the solution. There used to be, a long time ago, chickenpox parties where mothers, when one mother would have a child with chickenpox, she would invite her friends over so that they would all get chickenpox, and then, that was their way to do it, But it's very different for chickenpox than a fatal, debilitating COVID. Which was a much more high risk. I'm not promoting chickenpox parties, but and this is, where science itself is talking about herd immunity. So sometimes people take it in their own hands to come up with their own solutions. So, but there was something deeper going on with the whole COVID thing that was really deeply, deeply about freedoms. And I think that there was also this, and it still is out there, this strong sense that there was something bigger going on here. It wasn't even just about your own government. As a couple I heard in a number of different countries, both online and offline, it's not really my government even. it's the world government. This vaccine's not for me. You know, I don't know what that world government is up to and why they put this COVID thing out there, but it's not for me. And this real anxiety and suspicion that something bigger was going on. And to be fair, we have never in the history of vaccines certainly ever had this level of rollout. Over 1 billion people have been vaccinated with one of the various COVID vaccines. That's a lot of people in the world. And people talk about concern that the safety trials weren't long enough. But one of the reasons the safety studies need to be long is so you get enough people vaccinated to have a sense of any rare adverse events. Well, we got so many vaccinated in such a short period of time. We got more than we've ever had for any one vaccine in this period of time. So this is a much better safety study. For those who are worried about longer term effects, that's something else. But really the length of safety studies is mostly so you get enough people that you might see that there's somebody who has a rare underlying condition, but you want to get as many different types of people. It's not so much about the length, it's about the number of people. And that was, we didn't talk to publics enough about the fact that, you know, the mRNA vaccine platform has been, you know, in research for 10 years. I mean, it's not something we whipped up last night, even though, you know, warp speed didn't help from a language perspective. We didn't talk about things like, you know, the fact that we had so many more people in a short time to prove the safety's even better. And we missed that boat. And we had an opportunity. It's frustrating from a communications perspective.
Yeah, it seems like people have a lot of anxiety and fear, and most of the cases, the anxiety and fear are due to uncertainty in all aspects. But as a scientist, we also know a lot of scientific findings, they can be uncertain, and they sometimes can be ambiguous and can be conflicting. And how this can contribute to the misinformation and rumors outside science. And anything we can do regarding this, because the science at the current stage, research in science is uncertain at the moment in most cases. Is there anything we can do around with this?
Science is about uncertainty. I mean, I think that's going to be a fundamental challenge in general because people want certainty, and science is constantly trying to improve. So it's something that we have to come to terms with. And it's always a question of when we have enough science and people feel enough motivation to benefit from whatever the intervention is, whatever the food is. I mean, another area we're having big challenges with is GMO, genetically modified foods. We cannot feed this planet with organically produced food. We need GMO. And the reality is, and we don't talk enough about this, and I think children need education on this, is I have one colleague who starts his lectures, who's a genetic modification scientist with the plant field. He starts with a slide of a beautiful field of wheat, and he points out that in the 2 minutes that or 1 minute that you're looking at this slide, there are probably about 1,000 naturally genetic modifications going on in that waving field of wheat. These plants are constantly modifying. And the small little modifications that are made are to keep them healthier, to make them more resistant to some funguses and bugs and whatever. Do you prefer to have pesticides thrown on them? Do you prefer to have, but we don't, and I think this kind of education needs to start very, very early. What's interesting to me is that some of the scientists that have been coming to me and my group particularly in the last year, to help with confidence building have been, a few of them, related to the whole genetics field, because there's a lot more genetic science with genomics. There's now we have this mRNA platform, and there's a lot more vaccines coming down the pipeline using that platform, or there are hopes of using that platform. You know, we've got it in terms of food, and we've got a food crisis. So there's been a lot of, and then medicine and diagnostics. So I think we need to start to get children in school to understand better some basics about genetics, some basics about what is DNA, what is RNA. I think we need, I've also heard some pretty curious and understandings of what immune systems are. I mean, it's amazing, people's imaginations about our immune systems. And I think some pretty basic stuff like that, I think, would help kids growing up. I do see a bit of a rebound with some children, particularly of parents who were anti-vaccines, kids who were not vaccinated because their parents refused. And some of them are saying, you know, are angry at their parents and trying to find their own vaccinations and kind of kicking back and saying, she didn't know any better. I'm not going to change her mind, but I'm going to go get my own vaccines, and starting cohorts of a different generation coming up and said, we know better. So, you know, sometimes you can get some organic solutions coming up and you support them. That's about it.
Yeah, like early support, like not only say from a child stage, but also say from the student, when students started study, try to let them know it's important to understand the science is about uncertainty. So we also have like other audience question regarding government regulation. So in your project, you have a lot of you involve a lot of different countries. So I assume different countries will have different level of regulation regarding the information and in terms of the transmission of information. So from your observation, does certain government regulation help or actually not help this process in terms of reducing the misinformation?
I think it's a mix. I mean, there's always this tension between kind of dictators that control information and will shut down cell towers and shut down companies because they don't want an alternative story to theirs. That's not helpful. And on the other hand, is it the government's role? I mean, in some countries, in some situations, these social media platforms, they have their own community rules. So for reputational reasons, some of them feel like they need to take responsibility because some publics are leaving them if they don't feel like they're protected enough. It's a tension, and it depends on the country and the government.
So we definitely discuss a lot of different aspects, and so like say for majority of the public, as we as individuals, do you have any top tips on us as individuals to be more cautious in order to avoid becoming a victim of misinformation or accidentally become a person who spread misinformation? Do you have any top tips regarding this aspect?
I'll turn to you, but I think the only thing I would say is think before you share. And I'm super cautious about sharing anything these days because I don't know who's on top of whatever it is, but just to think twice. I think probably most of you do anyway, but if you're talking to your kids or to others, I do think there is a generation coming up that is much more conscious that it's not all good, because I think there was the honeymoon period with the first generation of people who, had this new medium, and it just, there were so many, we were so enthralled with the potential for it. It's only when it starts to go off piste, as they say, that you start to see what, the problematic side. And I think that's where it's getting more and more regulated. But yeah, I would just say, think twice before you share. But over to our media expert here.
It's not only media, it's about us, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, exactly.
As our own
Yeah.
behaviors. And
Yeah.
exactly that. Think before you share, what is it that we want people to think about? What should we think about? It's about basics of media and digital literacy. Check the source. Do you trust this? Do you know the source? So there's the factual side of all of it. I think there's also the emotional side of it as well, which you talked about. How are you feeling right now? Are you a bit angry? Are you more likely to share that because you're having high emotions? Did that piece evoke emotion in you? And is that a clue, perhaps, that there is something behind it? So we know that the emotional triggers that some of these posts are created around are there to get us clicking.
That's a really important point. Yeah.
So be aware of that. I think there are other points that have come out from studies around why do we feel that we need to post this anyway? Is it because we want to be seen as the first in our social media circle or the most active? Are we just trying to be helpful to people and we think that some information rather than no information is more helpful? So perhaps it's being aware of all of those pitfalls, factual and emotional, and as Heidi says, just really think and pause. And it's probably better to not share it than it is to share it if there's any doubt whatsoever.
Thank you very much for all the sharing. And we are approaching the end of this session. So before we conclude, so Heidi, do you have any take-home message in addition to the advice you just gave?
I think that's probably the
topic.
Yeah. Think before you share. But also, I think the one other thing I would say is actually everybody's had a pretty rough couple of years in different ways. And whenever you have an opportunity to just hear someone out, just listen. And I think that a lot of people need an opportunity to just talk about what they went through. And I think it's going to be really important because one of our biggest fallouts from the last couple of years, and it's having an impact we're seeing on a lot of other things, is we've got we have serious mental health challenges ahead. We have a lot of angry youth who missed out on, it's one thing when you're older and you can rationalize it a little bit, but when you're younger and you feel like you lost your social life, you lost your schools, you lost your, it was just stolen from you. I think the more we can, have a listen to people, there's something that we have a psychiatrist in our school as part of our global mental health program. He's actually from Zimbabwe. And he started something called the Friendship Bench before COVID. But it's just, a log. Two people sat on, actually New York City picked up on this idea. And just having a listen, I think the more we can let people kind of process what they've been through, it's every little bit will count, and it won't be showing up in people refusing health interventions because they never got it out in some other way. So I think we all should be open to having a listen in your clinic, in your work, whatever.
Listening and understanding each other is.
You may not understand, you may not agree with it too. I mean, that's another thing. There's a lot of different opinions out there, and I think we have to, there's a lot of intolerance right now, and I think we need to be able to listen, and you may not agree with anything the other person is saying, but at least you've given them an opportunity. You may not agree with it, but just we need to start to build an opportunity to have a conversation again.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah.
Yes, you said it. That's my concluding. We hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody to join this session. And last, we thank both of the panel members and who contribute to such a thoughtful session. Thank you.
Thanks.